Good afternoon, everyone. Good morning, good evening, depending where you are. And welcome to the third day of the UK PONI Conference. Thank you for joining us today. In the last days, we're really happy to have you with us. We have another great day lined up for you today, like the last two. So we're really glad that you're able to join us today. And we will get started with our first panel of the day today, which we have titled Regional Deterrence Dynamics. And we have three great panelists joining us today for what I expect will be a really interesting conversation. And on this panel, we'll cover a diverse set of case studies looking at nuclear decision-making in a number of countries and regions around the world. And the presenters will walk us through their research on how we can better understand countries' thinking on their nuclear programs, the use of nuclear weapons, and how we can then apply that to address regional proliferation challenges and to target particular proliferation threats. So it'll be a really interesting conversation that I'm really looking forward to. And as I mentioned, I have three great panelists joining us today. We really have an international panel with us. We have with us Rizwan Asghar, who is a PhD candidate in political science at the University of California, Davis. His research focuses on civil-military relations, conflict dynamics, and nuclear proliferation. His doctoral dissertation explores how the quality of civil-military relations affects domestic and foreign security policies. Now, Rizwan is joining us from California today, where it's just turned 5 a.m., I think. So I very much respect him and thank him for joining us at such an early hour. We also have Betty Saul with us, who's calling in from Germany. She's a PhD fellow at the Institute for Peace Studies and Security Policy at the University of Hamburg. In her dissertation, she analyzes the DPRK's official rhetoric as strategic signaling vis-a-vis the US. Betty is also a research fellow at the German Council of Foreign Relations and a visiting fellow at the German Institute for International and Security Affairs. And least, but certainly not last, calling in from Ireland is Tom Hickey. He is an international security specialist with a focus on arms control, non-proliferation, strategic technologies. Tom currently works at the United Nations Institute for Disarmament Research as a project assistant for the Middle East WMD Free Zone project. And I realize I actually haven't introduced myself. I'm Darya Dolzikova. I'm a research fellow at RUSI with the Proliferation and Nuclear Policy team. And I'm very excited to be chairing what I think will be a really diverse and interesting panel and conversation. Before we get started, just a quick reminder or just an update for those of us who might be joining us for the first time. If you do have any questions for the panelists, we really do want to hear them, so please send them along in the Q&A function on your screen, and I will be sure to pass those on to the panelists so we can have a bit of an interactive discussion. Right, well, without further ado, we'll get started. So Rizwan, if you want to get us started, please go ahead. Oh, Rizwan, you're still on mute.
Sorry. Thank you so much for the introduction. Good afternoon, everyone. Today, I'm presenting my research on how civil-military relations exercise a moderating influence on nuclear weapons capability and likelihood of interstate conflicts. The most specific research question that I seek to address is how do nuclear weapons affect states' likelihood of initiating low-level military conflicts? This is an important question because there is an apparent contradiction at the center of our understanding about nuclear weapons. On the one hand, many scholars argue that nuclear weapons were in fact largely responsible for long peace between two major powers during the Cold War period. On the other hand, it is widely believed that spread of nuclear weapons is increasing the risk of a nuclear war. So how do we reconcile this contradiction between our peaceful nuclear past and a fearful nuclear future? This paper offers one solution to this question by looking at the domestic politics of states and argues that effects effect of nuclear weapons on conflict actually depends on the nature of civil military relations in a country. When it comes to decisions regarding the use of force, what we know from existing political science literature that civilian and military leaders usually tend to have very divergent opinions or preferences. Military officers, because of their socialization and training, tend to be more hawkish and more likely to approve the use of force. On the other hand, civilian leaders, due to their domestic constraints in the form of audience cost mechanisms, are less likely to approve the use of force. So, civil military relations would determine the risk proneness of a country. Countries with strong civilian control of the military would be less likely to take risks and initiate conflicts, or on the other hand, countries with weak civilian control of the military would tend to be more hawkish and more likely to initiate conflicts because these hawkish preferences of the military would be prevailing more in policymaking processes in the absence of strong civilian control of the military. So, what exactly happens when states acquire nuclear capability? Nuclear capability would elevate the capacity of states with weak civilian control to initiate more conflicts because now these states with weak civilian control have a nuclear shield to hide behind, and they can use that nuclear shield to be more aggressive in their foreign policy behavior without having to worry about full scale conventional war. On the other hand, if states have strong civilian control, we would not see the emboldening effect of nuclear weapons because such states are not going to be very risk prone. This argument actually helps us better understand nuclear deterrence dynamics in South Asia. Right before the advent of nuclear capability in the region, both India and Pakistan were enjoying a really long time of relative peace and stability. Both countries had not fought a major war since 1972, which was the longest period of peace in their history. But after acquiring nuclear capability within a year, Pakistan, a state with consistently weak civil military relations and weak civilian control of the military, chose to initiate Kargil conflict and challenge India militarily in the Kargil region of Kashmir. Secondly, after 2 or 3 years, we saw another crisis between Pakistan and India, which was the largest military standoff in their history. What Pakistan was choosing to do by initiating these two crises was first, like a country can afford to be more aggressive without having to worry about the possibility of a full scale conventional war, or in this case, retaliation from India, because introduction of nuclear capability makes full scale conventional war almost impossible. Secondly, by choosing to initiate conflict, Pakistan was hoping to get more international diplomatic intervention to resolve Kashmir crisis. This leads to my key hypothesis, which is that the relationship between nuclear weapons capability and the likelihood of conflict initiation decreases with strong civilian control. I test this hypothesis using cross-sectional time series data on more than 160 countries of the world for the time period from 1946 to 2010. My dependent variable is militarized dispute, interstate dispute initiation, and militarized interstate dispute initiations are usually defined as any a threat, display, or actual use of force by one state towards another. For the purpose of this analysis, I only include those myths in my data that escalate to the use of force. My key independent variable is nuclear capability, whether a state which on a dichotomous scale, whether a state has nuclear capability during a given year. And in my data, there are 10 different nuclear states, including South Africa, for the period from 1972 1982 to 1980. And my moderating variable is civilian control of the military. This variable is based on two observable indicators of civil-military relations. First, whether political leaders of a country have served in the military or maintained ties with the military in the past. Secondly, number of military officers in national cabinets of the countries. These two observable indicators would help us measure the level of civilian control of the military in a country. Given the dichotomous nature of my dependent variable MIDS initiation, I test my hypothesis using logistic regression model, and what we can see in model 1 that nuclear capability does not have an significant and independent effect on likelihood of MIDS initiation, but civilian control is negatively correlated and is significant, which suggests that more civilian control actually leads to less likelihood of conflict initiation. Then what we see in model 3 that nuclear capability, when it interacts with strong civilian control of the military, it is those states are less likely to initiate conflicts, and this relationship is significant and negative, which suggests that as as this level of civilian control of the military increases in a country, that country is less likely to initiate conflicts. This is probably more clear here, where this is a predictive margins plot of nuclear capability with 95% confidence intervals, where we can see that as the level of civilian control of the military increases, the likelihood of conflict in nuclear states goes down. However, there is no basically change in likelihood of conflict for non-nuclear states. So what does this analysis really tell us about the world and what it can help us predict? Would we see a continuation of our peaceful nuclear past or a more fearful nuclear future? And the answer to that question is it depends. It depends on what kind of states are going to acquire nuclear capability in the future and how those states would behave. Right now, we have certain nuclear aspirants like Egypt, Iran, Saudi Arabia, and Turkey. And the worrisome aspect is that, with the exception of Saudi Arabia, the level of civilian control is not very strong in these countries. So, by looking at my empirical analysis and then case illustration of Pakistan, what we can predict that these states like Egypt, Iran, and Turkey, where historically the military has exercised an oversized influence in domestic politics, if these states acquire nuclear capability, they are much more likely to adopt an aggressive foreign policy behavior. So, whether nuclear weapons lead to increased likelihood of conflict, that would depend on what kind of states acquire nuclear capability. If these states with weak civilian control acquire nuclear capability, we would see more conflict. But if states with strong civilian control acquire nuclear capability, we would see less conflict. Based on that, my policy recommendation is that we should go for targeted counter-proliferation strategies. What that means that the international community should focus more on those countries where civilian control of the military is not very strong, because these countries are more likely to adopt aggressive foreign policy behavior. These countries are more likely to see emboldening effect of nuclear weapons if they acquired nuclear capability. So international community can do two specific things. First, deny the supply of nuclear material to these countries for any kind of purposes. Secondly, help strengthen the domestic institutions within these countries, because it is civilian control of the military that is determining how these countries would view their acquisition of nuclear capability. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Rizwan. That was really interesting. And I think, as you pointed out at the end, some really interesting policy implications from your research that hopefully we'll get a chance to dig into a little bit in the Q&A. I know I already have some questions that I'm itching to ask you. Before we do that, though, I'll hand the floor over to Betty, who will be talking to us a little bit about the DPRK's signaling vis-a-vis its nuclear deterrent. Go ahead, Betty.
Thanks, Darya, and big thank you to the RUSI team, and hello, everyone. Now, switching gears and shifting the topic and the geographic focus a bit, you have probably seen these kinds of headlines or even read language from North Korea, which I, by the way, refer to by its official name, the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, so DPRK. And I think we often tend to treat this kind of language in two different ways. Either we opt to ignore and write this kind of language off as exaggerations or bluffing, or we opt to validate and take these threats quite literally. Now, why the right way is, as so often, somewhere in the middle between these two extremes, I would like to show that looking at official language from the DPRK is indeed useful, but only to a certain extent. And my point is that analyzing official language from Pyongyang is useful if we take it as signaling, so as communication with strategic intent. In my PhD research, I look at the DPRK signaling and the use of its nuclear weapons development program more broadly. For this presentation, I'm focusing on what Pyongyang signals about its deterrence posture. So what does Pyongyang communicate to the US to deter Washington, to convince Washington from refraining from attack or invading the DPRK? To do this, I look at three elements. First is resolve, so what the DPRK signals about how likely it is to use its nuclear weapons. Second, capabilities, so what qualities of its nuclear forces Pyongyang emphasizes. And third, their mission, so signals relating to how the DPRK might employ its nuclear weapons. I will now briefly run you through my research design and then outline some key findings and conclusions. So I am looking at official DPRK language published in writing. The Korean Central News Agency is my main source here. For this presentation, I'm focusing on statements and reporting published in 2016, 17, and 18, which is the last of 5 subcases in my dissertation that covers the time from 1992 to 2018. I am conducting qualitative content analysis, so I'm going through these texts to distinguish between what I call noisy signals and strategic signals. By strategic signals, I mean signals that carry relevant information for the target state. They have concrete purposes, such as to influence the target state's strategic calculus, ideally in the signaling state's interest. And noisy signals are much more frequent, and they do not necessarily carry new, important, or any information. And if purposive, noise rather distracts, confuses, or shapes perceptions in the long run. So this distinction between noisy and strategic is pretty much a case-by-case judgment call on the basis of these questions. First and foremost, what is being said, what information is relayed? Then how is this information framed or presented? But third, and most importantly, actually, who is saying this? What level of authority is attributed to this information? Then also, has this information been said before? If so, how often? And lastly, what does this information correlate with, or what is this information explicitly or implicitly linked to? And with this set of questions, I try to carve out strategic signaling by the DPRK that is targeting the US. Now, the main part of my presentation, the 3 elements of deterrence posture, first resolve, capabilities, and then missions. The DPRK signaling consists mostly of signals of resolve. So signals of resolve are generally very frequent and thereby pretty noisy. Nevertheless, communicating resolve matters to deterrence posture. Resolve forms an essential part to the credibility of the deterrent threat. The DPRK is very clear, particularly about these three things. First, it emphasizes a very high level of determination and readiness, of combat preparedness and constant contingency planning, referring to its very own definition of the conflict with the US at hand and the de facto state of war that it sees itself in. Second, it emphasizes to continuously improve existing systems, to develop new systems, to mass produce operational systems, and to have sufficient production capabilities and resources to this regard. And third, it portrays the Korean People's Army to be on high alert generally, and in relation to certain contexts, such as US-RK joint military exercises, it states its strategic forces to be on hair trigger alert, meaning that it maintains its deployed nuclear forces at ready for launch status. Regarding its nuclear forces, three key signals that the DPRK issues here are the following. First, it is relatively quick in designating tested systems as operational, often framing test launches as drills and trainings for readiness and operational improvement, such as salvo training for short-range ballistic missiles. Not all operational systems, however, are then automatically framed as deployed, which is, for example, the case with its intercontinental ballistic missiles. Second, the DPRK goes to great lengths to present its tested capabilities as reliable, going into detail particularly on guidance and control, re-entry, and targeting accuracy. For example, being very detailed and explicit in public about re-entry vehicle simulations in 2016. Third, the DPRK projects to have a diverse arsenal of nuclear forces. It emphasizes the production of different nuclear bomb and warhead designs of different composition and yields, including simple fission and boosted fission or thermonuclear designs that are, quote unquote, adjustable to tens or hundreds kilotons of yield. It also emphasizes to have a range of different delivery vehicles from short to long range, as well as ground-launched and sea-launched ballistic missiles. This signal of maintaining a diverse nuclear arsenal is closely linked to the DPRK's threats of how it would employ its nuclear forces. First, and the most common signal, which is also a very noisy signal, often overlapping with noisy signals of resolve, is the threat of escalation, or rather the threat of assured escalation. The DPRK projects any situation that includes the use of military force against it as a situation that will end in nuclear exchange. Second, the DPRK emphasizes counter-force targeting, naming US military bases in Japan and Guam particularly. It also mentions US bases in ROK and in South Korea, but these threats are much more conditional and context dependent. It does threaten also counter-value targeting, but again, these threats are very context dependent and conditional. And third, the DPRK depicts the Pacific as a theater of war, threatening that military force on the Korean Peninsula will not stay local, but expand to include strategic strikes in line with its counter-force targeting. Now, coming back to my point at the very beginning, official language from Pyongyang should neither be ignored and underestimated nor overestimated. Much of its rhetoric is strategic signaling, and it should be taken with a grain of salt. At the same time, this signaling is relevant and informative, and it forms a major part of its deterrence posture. The DPRK signaling is pretty much in line with a posture of minimum deterrence, as well as a posture that manipulates significant risk of nuclear exchange and unacceptable consequences. Signaling is also in and of itself posturing. The DPRK postures to be capable of asymmetric escalation. More ambitiously, Pyongyang emphasizes diversity and survivability of its nuclear forces in order to project a posture of assured retaliation. So a posture of striking the continental US, of holding the US homeland hostage. While the DPRK might aim to be capable of assured retaliation, an alternative posture, namely asymmetric retaliation, of striking US bases in Japan and Guam, for example, in response to strikes on the DPRK, appears much more feasible. But this kind of posture would require at least a certain degree of survivability and reliability of counter-strike forces, in addition to functional command, control, and communication in contingencies. And with this, I thank you for your attention and hand back over to Darya.
Thanks, Betty. Another really great presentation. Again, I think with really interesting policy implications. It's also considering the amount of communication that we do see from North Korea on these kinds of things and how inflammatory it can be sometimes. It really is helpful to have it sort of broken down and categorized and really analyzed the way that you have. I think that's really, really interesting. Let's switch gears one more time to a whole other part of the world. And for that, I'll turn it over to Tom, who is going to talk us through some of the challenges and opportunities when it comes to the Middle East WMD Free Zone. Tom, go ahead.
Okay, I'm having some slight issues with my presentation. Okay, well, I think the presentation might not be working today, but it was just a bunch of pictures to illustrate the points that I was going to make. So
we can
just
perhaps get somebody from the RUSI end to put it up for you, if that's helpful.
Okay, great, thanks. So hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this presentation today. I'm going to be covering the Middle East WMD Free Zone. And having some technical difficulties.
Would it be helpful to put it up on our end, or?
Give me just 1 second. Okay, here we go. So hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this presentation where I'll be giving you a brief overview of the Middle East WMD Free Zone issue. I'm going to start with history, move on to some of the challenges facing the process and the region today, and then finish with some recommendations for how to progress dialogue on the zone. And just as a side note, I will be speaking in a personal capacity today. So let's start with the basic question. Why should you care about the Middle East WMD Free Zone, and why is it important? I think it's clear if you look at the history of the zone, it has a very, very long history of WMD proliferation and use. And many states in the region have or have had biological, chemical, and nuclear weapons programs, development, stockpiling, and even use. And therefore, WMDs are a key driver of regional insecurity and concern for the states of the region and the international community more broadly. In addition, several regional states are not party to international agreements such as the Chemical Weapons Convention, Biological and Toxin Weapons Convention, Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, and Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. And when it comes to use cases, obviously in the modern day, we've seen chemical weapon use in Syria, but also going back a few decades in the Iran-Iraq War and in the North Yemen War. And on the nuclear side of things, 4 states of the region, that's Iraq, Libya, Iran, and Syria, have been reported by the International Atomic Energy Agency to the UN Security Council for concerns surrounding their nuclear programs and possible safeguards violations. So really for me, if there's one region in the world where there's a serious risk of further nuclear and WMD proliferation in the world, it's the Middle East. And a number of factors really exacerbate this, including broader regional security dynamics and ongoing processes such as the JCPOA, re-implementation negotiations, which are influencing this. But really, worst case scenario, we could see a proliferation spiral if regional conditions and security situation do not improve, and perhaps even a regional arms race. You know, if Iran were to acquire nuclear weapons, Saudi Arabia has stated that they would also acquire nuclear weapons, and then after that, who knows? And that would be very, very bad for the region and very, very bad for the world. So now if we move on to the next slide, I'm just going to, over the next few minutes, going to fly through the history of the process. So it all starts back in 1974, when Egypt and Iran co-sponsor a resolution calling for the establishment of a Middle East nuclear weapons-free zone as part of the 29th UN General Assembly. And so resolution 3263 was adopted. Next slide. 1990, the Mubarak initiative calls to expand the scope of the zone to all WMD. So now it's not just nuclear weapons, but also biological and chemical weapons. Next slide. Following the 1991 Madrid Peace Conference in the Middle East, the so-called Arms Control and Regional Security Working Group is established, or AGRS for short. And this was a high-level group which met between 1991 and 1994, and was a series of 6 plenary sessions which were held on a variety of confidence and security building measure topics on things like military hotlines, crisis communications, verification and monitoring, and maritime security, to name just a few. And this was very important because it was the first time that Arabs and Israelis had sat across from each other at the negotiations table and discussed some of these core regional security issues directly, although some other regional states did not participate in the process. AGRS was also a great opportunity for building high-level connections and have frank discussions on regional security issues, identify contentious topics, and also areas where progress could be made on issues of mutual concern. And if we fast forward again to the 1995 Amputee, next slide, please. So in 1995, at the Amputee Review Conference, along with the decision to extend the treaty indefinitely, as part of this sort of grand bargain, the Amputee states parties adopted a resolution, which was co-sponsored by the Russian Federation, United Kingdom, and the United States, calling for the establishment of a WMD free zone in the Middle East, and specifically that practical steps towards the establishment of an effectively verifiable Middle East zone free of weapons of mass destruction, nuclear, chemical, and biological, and their delivery systems. And this was the first time there was sort of a formal commitment to further the zone issue. Next slide, please. So then if we fly to the 2010 Amputee Review Conference as part of the 64-point action plan, which is adopted at the end of the conference, one of the points was that the participants requested that the 3 co-sponsors of the 1995 resolution, that's US, UK, and Russia again, together with the UN Secretary General, would appoint a facilitator and convene a regional conference on the establishment of the zone. And this was finally a formal commitment to hold a conference on the zone by 2012 at the latest. And so the host country is selected, that's Finland, and Ambassador Jaakko Laajava of Finland, as you can see here pictured, was nominated as the facilitator of these discussions and the conference. However, if we then go to 2012, it's announced that the conference has been postponed indefinitely. And the co-conveners here cite regional conditions and a lack of agreement about the scope and mandate of the conference among regional states. However, Ambassador Laajava doesn't give up right there, and between 2013 and 2014, the so-called Lyon-Geneva process takes place. And this is a series of informal, high-level consultations with Laajava, 16 Arab states, and Israel. And the Lyon-Geneva consultations, it had a bit of a mixed outcome. On one hand, the states agreed on the importance of convening a conference, but it also revealed a stark difference in positions. So on one hand, Israel prefers to discuss broader regional security issues and creating a process to address this, while countries such as Israel see this approach as an excuse to avoid addressing core disarmament commitments. So next slide. And then we jump to 2018, and this is where we see a drastic change, which really impacted the zone process as we see it today. So frustrated by the lack of progress and convening a conference, the Arab states put forward a decision at the first committee of the UN General Assembly, which requests that the UN Secretary General convene a regional conference on the establishment of the WMD Free Zone. And this is a conference which should take place annually until the conference concludes the elaboration of a legally binding treaty establishing a zone. And all decisions are to be taken by consensus by the states of the region. And this move was really criticized by Israel and the US, and it was seen as an attempt to force the zone issue and was sort of circumnavigating previous consensus-based approach, which apparently had not worked. So if we go to the next slide, in 2019, in November, the first zone conference takes place. And of course, the US and Israel do not participate. Despite this, the first zone conference was largely seen as a success. It wasn't too ambitious and was quite realistic. And the outcome was that the states adopted a political declaration, agreed on the date of future conferences every November, and on the presidency of the conference. Go to the next slide. In this section, I'm going to cover some of the challenges facing the zone today. So it's clear that regional geopolitical tensions play a huge role in zone discussions. And I'm not going to surprise anyone by saying this, but Middle East it's complicated. It's tense, unpredictable, and prone to sudden increases in tensions, as we saw recently. There's also a lot of political instability in many countries and also inherent asymmetries in military capabilities and threats, which leads to a sense of insecurity among the states of the region. And related to this point is the role of outside actors. Are they guarantors of the process? And if we look back at the failure by the co-conveners to host the conference, or should the outside actors be leading in the process, or should it be coming only from the regional states? And if it is coming only from the regional states, are they actually going to be able to agree and do something? And on this note as well, many countries have strategic interests, geopolitical interests, military forces in the region, US, China, Russia, and Turkey, just to name a few. And this really impacts the security dynamics of the region and the zone process by extension. Another challenge for today's process is the legitimacy of the current conference. So as I mentioned, US and Israel are not participating officially. So can meaningful progress be made without their participation and support? And also, how can they be encouraged to re-engage, if at all? And this is where the sort of diplomatic game argument comes in. So from one perspective, there's the view that the entire process has been designed to coerce Israel to disarm, and it's seen that there's an unwillingness to see the zone in the context of broader security dynamics in the region. So there is an agreement that WMDs should be addressed, but not in isolation. And on the other hand, some states would say that piling these very, very complex regional security discussions on top of the already very, very complicated zone process could be viewed as an attempt to ensure a permanent stalemate on the issue. When it comes to the scope of the zone, so the countries that are included officially is 22 members of the League of Arab States, Iran, and Israel, so 24 countries in total. But again, the role of other regional actors such as Turkey is important, which is a neighbor to the region and is very involved in regional security. So what role would these countries have? In terms of the scope of capabilities included, so obviously nuclear, chemical, and biological weapons, but then there's the challenge of addressing what does means of delivery actually mean? Is it only means of delivery as it relates to WMDs, or should things like missiles be addressed more broadly and in general? And missiles are a big concern for many of the states in the region and are arguably more concerning than WMDs. And then what about things like other sorts of means of delivery, drones or UAVs, even aircraft, or they also have to be negotiated as part of this process. So it's very complicated. If we go to the next slide, we can have to consider verification. So how do you ensure that nobody is cheating, nobody is violating the WMD free zone? And here the role of international organizations such as the International Atomic Energy Agency, OPCW, is very important to verify commitments in nuclear and chemical. But then what do you do about biological weapons? How is that verifiable? There's no such body for biological weapons. And also on this note of international orgs, if we take a case study of nuclear and we go back to 1991, at this time, Iraq had a comprehensive safeguards agreement with the IAEA. This was sort of the gold standard of nuclear verification and monitoring. And then, of course, in parallel, it was discovered that they had a clandestine nuclear weapons development program. And this was a huge shock to the reliability of the safeguards concept. And since then, of course, the IAEA has enhanced safeguards greatly, particularly with the adoption of the Model Additional Protocol in 1997. But the potential for future cases is still of concern. And of course, chemical weapons, Syria, there was a failure to deal with chemical weapons there. Syria supposedly disarmed, and then chemical weapons were used again. And what were the consequences of this? Nothing meaningful apart from a loss of voting rights at the OPCW. But in addition to international monitoring, it's also important to have some regional monitoring agencies. So for example, for nuclear monitoring, there could be a regional body like Euratom in Europe or ABAC in South America between Brazil and Argentina. So it would also be a challenge to create this regional monitoring body. And if you go to the next slide, final point here is compliance and enforcement. How do you make sure people comply, and what do you do in cases of non-compliance? Can regional states take action, or is external authority required, such as the UN Security Council? And should a regional body be created with a dispute mechanism similar to the JCPOA? And what do you do about non-state actors, which obviously play a very, very large role in the region? So if you could skip forward 2 slides now. And another one. So how to make real progress on the zone and broader questions around regional security. This is the final section here. So I think the states for the region need to build on regional developments. Obviously, we see here the Abraham Accords, and there's a broader regional trend of normalization with Israel and a shifting role of external players. And this is an opportunity for the states of the region to address joint regional concerns, perhaps not directly related to the zone, but on issues of mutual concern, such as terrorism, cross-border criminal activities, arms and drugs trafficking, or even environmental issues. If we go to the next slide, another area of potential cooperation is on regional science and technology. And there are already some successful examples of this, like the Sesame project, which is based in Jordan. So nuclear technology, peaceful use of nuclear energy is a good area for cooperation, perhaps in the technology sectors or even the space industry. Another idea could be to create regional risk reduction centers for nuclear, chemical, and biological risks, and also disaster response. And this would sort of facilitate as well scientific and technical exchanges among the states of the region, and could eventually lead to the creation of regional centers of excellence or expertise in different countries. It's also important to help foster civil society dialogue in the region, including think tanks. And there must be a strong track-to dialogue to lay groundwork for when political conditions are conducive for negotiations. And this could perhaps be supported by initiatives or funding from international organizations, the European Union, or individual states. Another idea, it would be great to have a second arms control and regional security group. And this would be a great opportunity to have a modern, updated dialogue on mutual security issues, sharing of security perceptions and challenges, and be really positive. Would also build expertise and contacts among participants. And what really needs to be addressed here is a reevaluation or even a creation of a regional security architecture. Can this be addressed as part of zone discussions, or does it require a separate parallel track? And is one dependent on the other? Can you have the zone without a regional security architecture? Can you have a good regional security architecture without addressing the issues covered by the zone? And perhaps would a OSCE type body for the region be useful here? Another point is that it would be great to provide training and expertise across WMD issues for young people and junior diplomats to ensure a level playing field. This could be done through scholarships and funding for training, which could be provided by the P5 or co-sponsors of the zone issue at the MBT. The zone is, of course, a collection of very, very complex legal, technical, and political topics. And without expertise, the zone will be impossible to negotiate. Go to the next slide. I think the JCPOA renewal would help to stabilize some tensions, particularly between Iran, Saudi Arabia, Gulf states, and Israel. It would also allow time for negotiations and dialogue to improve relations among these states, and might also leave the door open for a JCPOA plus type deal in the future to cover other areas of concern, such as missiles. I think also the role of the US and Israel is very, very important here. The US should re-engage with the zone process in a meaningful way, sort of an important external actor, and encourage better dialogue between key parties, including Israel. I think for Israel, the Arab states sort of have more of a responsibility to try and reframe the debate a bit around the zone in order to make Israel feel a bit more comfortable, and that the zone issue is not just everybody versus Israel to disarm nuclear weapons. I think at least for the next conference, Israel and the United States could consider participating in some way, for example, as observers. If we go to the next slide, just to conclude here and wrap up, I think the zone is a really important issue that needs to be addressed in the region today. It's clear that the zone is not going to happen tomorrow. It's definitely a long-term goal, but I think there are plenty of low-hanging fruit, and there are a range of confidence and security building measures which could be adopted by the states of the region, which could improve conditions and prepare for future negotiations and dialogue. And what's really key here is engagement and dialogue among key states. So thank you for your attention. I look forward to your questions.